Welcome to the Home Meat Cutting Series and the Game Processing video, Process Like a Pro. Whether you're just back from the hunt or from your local meat packer, you will find that by using proper techniques to custom cut your carcass, it will assure you a nicer meal on your dinner table. You will learn how to get the most out of your hunt, plus the satisfaction of knowing that it was done right. So here is your video meat cutter, Chuck Pencer.
I'm Chuck, and today I'm going to show you how to process your game like a professional. Whether it's deer, elk, antelope, or livestock, it all comes apart just about the same. I've got some carcasses hanging in the garage. Let's go to work. Before we get started processing, let's take a look at the tools required to handle the task. First, I've got a 6-inch boning knife. If you've noticed, the blade has a bit of flex to it. This will help you bearing down against the bones, so you make sure you take all the red meat off of the bone. Secondly, what I'm using is a 8-inch serrated knife. You could even use a 10-inch knife. This will help you when you're slicing and you're breaking. A trusty steel to keep the point on your knife during your processing. Here's a hint for you. If you don't have a meat saw readily available, take hacksaw out of your toolbox. I like to use a coarse blade. It helps you get through the meat a little bit easier. So we're going to show you this processing with a hacksaw. And lastly, a hook comes in handy for breaking. Let's get started on this 4-quarter. For you game hunters, we've brought in this beef to show you the similarities between the 4-quarter of beef and your venison. We're going to break this into the primal cuts to show you the basic break. And turn this around, count 5 ribs up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and mark the 4-quarter. This would be at the point I would separate the rib from the chuck. Turning it back around, I've got my mark. First, I'm going to pull the brisket down and save the brisket. On your venison, you wouldn't do this, but the brisket, it happens to be a nice piece of meat. We're going to pull this down, keep the brisket separate from the rib. Anytime you're doing any cutting, you're using the point of your knife just to separate the membranes between the muscles. When you're doing your venison, you'll be using the same technique. I've pulled the brisket away, so now I can go ahead and make my cut. So we're going to maintain the square cut through the rib and cut it, break the chuck apart. This is exactly the point where you would break your venison at the end of the blade. So you have your rib section separated and your chuck section. Now that I've got the 4-quarter knifed, separating the chuck from the rib, there is only a section of backbone and a piece of cartilage holding the two together. We'll take a hacksaw and also a hook, make sure the 4-quarter doesn't land on the ground, and separate it. That. Here we are with the beef hindquarter, and again we're going to use the hindquarter to show you the similarities between the primal cuts of the venison and the beef. Basically, there's 2 cuts to separate the loin from the round. You're going to drop the full beef loin, and then you're going to have the full beef round. Beef is a little bit different, but structurally the same. As in your venison, any good meat that you have an opportunity to save, take that opportunity and save it. So we're going to take this elephant ear off this hindquarter, which happens to be lean meat. Again, what we're trying to stress in this video is knife style, showing you how easy it is to process game, beef, whatever you have. I'm just removing the lean meat. This is your flank. I'm going to have to come around this side to remove the flank so you can see it. Just going to pull this up. Cutting between the seams, remove the flank. I happen to be cutting this up for a friend and he wants a tri-tip roast, so I'm going to pull a tri-tip roast out of this. What we're attempting to do is separate the loin from the round. Doing so, I'm going to clear a little bit of this cod fat away so you can see what we're doing. Here's the hip bone or the H bone. There's a joint here which we're going to try to hit with the tip of the knife, cut through the loin. Spin it around, keeping my knife straight, falling through to the backbone. Again, with my hacksaw and my hook, I'm going to separate the loin from the round.
Take your time and be patient. This bone is about 4 times larger than your average venison bone.
There we have the full beef loin. Okay, now we're moving on to this buck. He's approximately 100-pounder. And before we start cutting him, what I'd like to show you is a few hanging techniques. This particular buck has been in the cooler for about 5 days, and he's got plenty of circulation, so his chest cavity is nice and dry. If you're not as fortunate to have that type of optimum situation, one tip is to open up the chest cavity. First of all, you've noticed the breastbone isn't split, so we're going to split the breastbone. If you're field dressing them from a tree, this might be the time to do this, depending on how far of a jaunt you have to go back to camp. So we're going to split him down his breastbone, and I'm going to knife it first to just make it a little bit easier to follow a line to saw down the breast. Sawing him all the way across down his throat. That'll help you break him open. Now what I was talking about is keeping the chest cavity dry. Is you pull the flanks down and leave him open like this. That'll get a lot more circulation in the chest cavity, and it'll cut down on some of the slickness that could develop in there. Okay, move around, and again, just like all our other breaks, I'm going to run the blade of the knife through the cartilage and remove the breast. Let's talk about refrigeration, which is the most important aspect of hanging your carcass. Temperature control is critical, maintaining a consistent temperature between 35 and 45 degrees. If you can't keep your carcass in this temperature zone, process it as soon as possible because it's not aging any longer, it's deteriorating. And that breakdown can occur as soon as the first day or up to several days, depending on the bacteria and temperature control. If your carcass is deteriorating, it doesn't stop until the meat is cut and in the freezer. Take that extra time in the field to really clean your carcass well. It'll pay off while you're processing and also at the dinner table. Again, we're going to our standard break. 5 ribs up to separate the chuck from the rib. Start at the very bottom rib, count 5 up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and mark him. And the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now we're going to separate the rib from the loin, which is 7 ribs. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Put your knife in, make a cut. And on the other side. We don't have to count up because we know where our mark is. That's where you separate him from. Just come down here. So now we've got the rib, the shoulder separated from the rib after we make this final cut. Keeping in mind you want to keep it as square as possible so you don't get your steaks all off kilter. Your chuck separated, your rib. Now you've got to separate your loin from your rump. Separating the short loin at the pin bone, or separating the top sirloin or the sirloin from the balance of the round. I like to separate it at the sirloin so you can feel the hip joint. What you want to do is stick your knife, your point of your knife, and try to pop that hip joint. You can feel a little cartilage tearing if you've hit it right. You can see the seam of the tip of the roast of the rump. Just cut right through that tip seam. Then bring it around to the tail, cutting back towards the tail, maybe a ½ an inch from the final vertebrae. That's a perfect example of leaving the large loin on the small loin, the loin attached. See if we can get as lucky on the second side. Again, feel the hip bone. Try to put the knife right into the joint. The seam of the tip, this is a nice one solid piece, be a sirloin tip if it was on a steer. We want to leave that intact. Just want to cut right below the sirloin tip. Coming back this way, separating the round from the top sirloin, cutting it back to the last vertebrae here on a straight line. And this should become separated like that. Now you can have your option of where you want to start separating your primal cuts. But you've got your forequarter, or your shoulders, which is your chuck, your rib, your whole loin, and then your rumps. I'm just going to take the saw and take the chuck off first. Just put the saw right against the backbone. A few simple cuts should have the shoulder removed. Now I find the most difficult part of butchering the deer is splitting the backbone. That's why we like to separate it in primals and then work on splitting the backbone. If you have a little bloody throat meat on the throat, cut it out before you start sawing. It'll just make your cleanup job a little bit easier. And we're going to proceed to split the chuck in half, ideally right through the backbone. Starting at the neck, let's see how lucky we get on this. Got to get a good start. Taking your time, saw them right down the center. Notice I'm trying to go right down this seam. I'm going to turn them around so I get a better view at the seam. Like I said, this is probably the most difficult part, butchering your own deer. Obviously, if you had a power saw, you could zip him in half in an instant. But today, we don't have that luxury because we don't think you're going to have it. So now we've got the shoulder separated. You notice the spinal cord is exposed on both sides. That means we've hit it pretty much right on. Here we have about a 100-pound ranch lamb, and again we're going to show you the breaking technique. Starting at the chest cavity, we're going to pull the flanks, down between the seam of the meat, saving the red meat. We'll pull that flank off that way. We'll pull the flank off of this side so we can see what's going on in the middle here. Now if you notice, you get an excellent view of the diaphragm here. This is the diaphragm is the part of the animal which separates the lungs and the heart from the intestines and the stomach. So we'll just loosen the diaphragm up. And the skirt steaks are actually the diaphragm. We'll pull those off.
Protect your carcass. Keep a good eye on it for signs of bacteria breakdown, such as a slick or slimy look or a bad discoloration. If you're unsure of the wholesomeness of your carcass, have a butcher or an experienced hunter check it for you.
Now we'll take the breast off, which is running it through the cartilage on the end of the ribs. Get your knife and run through the soft cartilage, the end of the ribs. It's one side, and we'll do the other side. We're going to take the knife, put it right through the cartilage at the end of the ribs. Now you've removed your breast. So we go back to counting the ribs, 5 up from the lower rib, so we can make a cut, separate the chuck from the rib. Come around this way, count 5 ribs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's where we want to make our cut. I'll make it closer to the backbone so I can get a square cut. 2, 3, 4, 5, and make that cut. I'll mark it. Okay, then we're going to cut 7 ribs up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's where your rib will end. So you have your chuck, 5 ribs up, your rib, 7 ribs up, and then that starts to your loin. So we'll mark that on each side. Cut this way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again, cutting right through the shoulder blade, tip of the shoulder blade. Turn it around to get a better view to make sure we're going in the right spot. And if all goes well, should end up with a nice square shoulder, which you can cut with your knife. Notice we've got the ribs marked off at 7 ribs. We'll just cut those right to the backbone. And if all goes well, you have another nice, square, even cut. Because this lamb is a little bit bigger, we've elected to break it how we did the hindquarter, which is at the hip joint, which is this joint here. So we're going to keep the loin fully intact. You can move the leg and feel the hip joint. Again, we're going to come in, just hopefully find that socket, cut right into the hip joint. That would be your full loin. Keeping it nice, square cut. Hip joint is here. We'll find the hip joint and then cut it straight across. So now you have your legs, your full loin, your rib, and your shoulder. And you just start with your hacksaw or your meat saw, take the shoulder off, ribs, the loin, and your legs or rounds. Then you would take your saw and proceed to split each primal down the backbone. Now that we've got our carcasses broken down into the primal cuts, let's take the primals into the kitchen where we can process them into steaks, roasts, chops, grind, and all the good stuff we promised you. Let's go into the kitchen. Here we are in the kitchen. My wife always enjoys when I bring the venison into the kitchen, but I like to do it because it seems like a more sanitary atmosphere. I've got my round which were separated. Now we're getting down to the fun part where I promised you more usable meat out of your carcass other than just hamburger. We're going to start here with the round. These rounds are nice size, out of a nice sized buck. So what we're going to do is bone these out. Like I showed you earlier, the tip muscle is a nice solid piece of muscle. And we're going to remove that as in one piece. I'm going to start up at the knuckle, fat part of the knife, into the cartilage of the knuckle. And follow the seam down right against the bone. Lay the point of the knife right against the bone and follow it down to the hip bone or the H bone. Like that. I'm going to turn it over, and you can see the white seam rather clearly on that. With the tip of the knife again, I'm just going to 1/4 inch into that seam and separate that seam. That is known as the sirloin tip. That should pull out all in one piece after you free it above from the cartilage. On a smaller deer, you would just be boning the round out without pulling this tip. On an elk or steer or larger animal, it's nice to pull this tip out. If you free the tip up from the bone, with the tip of your knife, you'll be able to just pull it out in one motion away from the bone. You have a nice solid little roast or something you can slice into steaks. Now moving on to the rest of the rump, or the round I should say. You've got the H bone or the hip bone. Again, with the tip of the knife, you start at the top of the bone and just follow the bone around using a little pressure to keep the tip of the knife against the bone. Cut it down one side, clear the bone, come around on the other side. I don't know if I can do this stand on my head, but I'll try to show you the action. Cut it into the joint, around the H bone. Tip of the knife again, just to free that up. Cartilage in the joint, you can pull away. And then the H bone just comes out in one piece. Like that. That's bone. So what you're left with is the round with the shank attached. This particular piece of meat, what we're going to do is bone the entire round out for jerky. So cut the hock off. Again, tip of the knife against the bone. One cut. Then with the very tip of the knife, just follow the seam right on down to separate the membrane from the bone. When you get to the knuckle, tip of the knife around the knuckle, back to the lower part of the rump, the round. Same thing on the other side. Tip of the knife follows the membrane right next to the bone. Little pressure against the bone. Make sure you leave the meat intact and no meat on the bone. If you've cleared the cartilage away from the bone on the top here, should be able to just seam it right out. Again, point of the knife working against the bone, little pressure, but not a lot of pressure, keeping your hand away from your blade of your knife, cutting down, remove bone from the round. Go around the hip joint, and you're home free. All bone out of that round. Now what you have here is a boneless round, less the tip. If I was to put the tip back on, you'd have a whole leg boneless there. Like I mentioned before, this is a larger size round, so we were able to take the tip off. Since we're going to make this jerky meat, what we're going to do is pull the shank portion off of the round, leaving intact the top round and the bottom round. I'll show you how to do that. Venison is real easy to cut because it's very little fat, and you can see exactly which muscle you want to remove. The top round is the inside of the round. So you just find the seam here, tip of the knife, come in and separate it from the heel. You're just separating the muscle. What you've got is one nice solid piece of muscle, which is the top round. We'll trim that up a bit later and show you how to make some beautiful jerky. The heel is very tough, sinewy piece of meat. Normally you're only going to use that for grind. Separate it at the seam and remove the heel. If you do like chili meat, there is a couple parts of the heel which can be salvaged for a nice chili grind. This is known as the rat of the heel, which is very gristly. So when you cut the rat up, be careful to cut it against the sinew in small pieces. That way you're ensured you don't clog up the head of the grinder when you're going to grind this. Can also be used for soup meat, but again, just for flavor, it's going to be real chewy. The heel, part of the heel, again, soup meat or grind. Bottom round. Now the bottom round, since we have a couple carcasses we're working on today, I've elected to make a nice venison roast out of joining two bottom rounds together. You notice there's a gland here in this fat pocket in the bottom round. Make sure you take that gland out. If you leave that in, that can spoil your whole roast with a foul taste. There's a little gland there. Okay, the bottom round has a seam on it here. I'm just going to stick my knife underneath that seam and remove it, so it's not an additional piece of gristle that you'd have to deal with after you turn this into a roast. Turn it over and trim it up. Now you could tie this into a 1 3-pound roast, or what I'm going to do is take the other round, bone it out exactly how I did, separate the tip, the top round, the bottom round. I've cleaned up the top round because what I'm going to do with this is set them in the freezer. A lot of times people have told me that they've had problems getting good jerky meat out of their carcasses. Normally you'd use a different cut of meat other than top round for jerky, but we've already got enough roast, and out of the shoulder we're going to get roast. So, and I love jerky, and along with a lot of other people out there, so I'm going to use the top round for jerky. I've cleaned up the top round real nice, and if I proceeded to cut this thin for jerky right now, with it being in a kind of a non-firm state, I'd get a lot of miscuts and I'd end up with a pile of stew. So what I'm going to do is just set this on a piece of wax paper like that and put it in the freezer and let it set up for about 15 to 20 minutes. What I mean by setting up is what it'll do, it'll firm up almost to the point of being frozen, but you'll be able to get your knife through it. We'll show you that when it comes out of the freezer in just a second. we've still got to deal with our tips, our sirloin tips. Again, depending on what the cuts of meat which you favor out of your carcass is really going to determine what you're going to do with your tips. You're going to clean them up, pull the joint off the back just by running the knife next to the bone, take the bone out, and then square them up so you've got a square piece of meat to work with. Now you can steak these by slicing them in steaks, which would be across the grain, slicing them this way, or tie it into a nice little roast, stew meat, kebab meat, various uses for the sirloin tip. This particular tip I'm going to show you how to make jerky out of as well. So I'm going to clean it up just a touch and also put that on a piece of wax paper. We'll throw that into the freezer. And I'll just show you the two differences between the top round and the sirloin tip as far as jerky goes. The sirloin tip and the top round, which I've cleaned up and put on the wax paper. Notice I'm not wrapping these because I'm just going to put them in the freezer to set up for a brief time, so you don't have to worry about freezer wrapping them. They're only going to be in the freezer for 15 minutes. Put them in the freezer any place where you can get a nice flat lie. About 15 minutes and those will be set up nicely so we can get some jerky out of them. Now come back to our top round. Again, we'll clean it up a bit. You can slice this first and then try to clean each individual steak up. I just think it's easier if we clean it up first, and that way we don't have to go back and clean up each individual steak. So I'm squaring this up. Now out of the top round, again, nice solid piece of meat. We're going to slice this into top round steaks, about an inch thick. These are great for broiling. You can actually barbecue these if you marinate them a bit. We'll get some nice top round steaks. Like that. With the heel, it's a good solid piece of meat, excellent for kebab meat. Let's cut it into a couple nice sized chunks. You lay that out on a kebab with some onions, tomatoes, bell peppers in between those, and you've got a real culinary delight. Moving on to the tip, pull the knuckle off. Throw that in the can. We'll square up the gristly end off of here so we have a nice square piece of meat. And like the top round, the tip, one solid muscle, which is good for steaks, roasts, jerky, anything you like to do with this. This particular one, we're going to cut it into steaks to go along with the round steaks. So we just cut it about an inch thick. And voila, got some beautiful sirloin steaks. Mind you, these aren't top sirloin steaks, they're sirloin tip steaks, but just the same, they are sirloin steaks. We've got bottom round roasts, our sirloin tip steaks, or sirloin steaks, our top round steaks. We've showed you the kebab meat out of the top round. And we'll get back to the tips and the top round in the freezer, and we'll slice those down for jerky meat. Together with the bottom round off the other side, depending on how large your family is, what I like to do is always have a roast around the house that's capable of feeding 8 to 10 people. So I'll take these two bottom rounds, tie them together, If I had some beef lard, might even lay some lard on the top of that and tie those up into a nice roast. Again, you have a nice solid piece of meat. Notice this particular bottom round is still connected with the eye. If this was a larger, say an elk or a beef, you'd be separating this eye at this seam with the tip of your knife. And using the eye for either steaks or roasts, then using your bottom round for Swiss steaks or for bottom round roasts. What I'm going to do is tie these two bottom rounds together to make a nice roast, nice big roast. I'd say it's about 6-pound roast at least, which would feed about 10 people, so we have company. And to do that, I'm going to tie it with the old butcher's knot, which is a unique knot which ensures you get a nice tightly rolled roast. Lay it underneath the roast. Your left hand pulls the string over, put your index finger out, lay the string on top of your index finger, make one loop, bring your thumb through. Whoops, let's try that again. Okay, you've got your string, pull it underneath your roast, pull it out in front of you. You're holding the string from the can in your index finger. Now you're taking the string that went under the roast on your finger, loop, put your thumb through, and grab the tail. Stretch it forward and snap it down. Tie it off. Let's try that again. Twine under the roast, back on your index finger, twist it around, thumb through, grab the tail, pull it tight, take the slack out, cinch it down. Cut the excess off. One more time, underneath the roast, finger, bring it around, grab the tail, take the slack out, cinch it down. It's a real easy knot to use and also to learn. What you end up with is a nice roast tied together. That piece slipped off a bit, so we'll try to put it on there a touch better. The idea is you're tying your roast together so it's tight, so you're going to get an even temperature through the roast. That way it's going to cook evenly. If you've got a couple little ends that are going to burn off when you're cooking the roast, you can cut those off and use them for kebab meat or for stew meat. You've got a nice roast. If you like the idea of a rolled roast, you can always, and you don't like the idea of having a 6-pound roast, go ahead and cut it in half and show you the two faces, and you have a couple beautiful rolled roasts like that.
Here's the full loin and rib.
As we've taken it off our carcass. Now if you were field dressing your carcass, this would be considered the start of the back strap and the end. We've made it nice and easy by just breaking it into this primal, the full loin. So what I'm going to do is bone this out as one piece, or actually remove the cuts off of the bone and leave the bone in one piece. The inside of the backbone lies your fillets. We're going to run the knife down inside the backbone, right against the bone, to remove this inside fillet here. Tip of the knife against the bone. You can turn it around, get a better view. And scooping out your fillet. And there's your fillet. Notice we still have the loin tail on. We'll take that off in one piece and separate it after we've got it cut. That's your tenderloin or your fillet. We'll show you how to cut those in a minute. Let's get the other one off of here. Bone on the back, knife against the bone. Stripping the fillet out, trying to save as much meat as possible. And through the loin tail. So you have your two tenderloins. Turn this over, turn the loin over. And now we're going to pull off the ribs, the loins, and the top sirloins, or the large loins, all in one piece. Put a little edge on your knife. Tip of the knife right against the backbone. This is easy, it just comes all the way down. Try to get a good view here. I'm using the knife right against the ribs to pull that meat right against the ribs. Tip of the knife right against the bone, working it slowly. We've removed the tenderloins. Now we'll come in and free up the top sirloin. Knife tip against the bone, riding the bone down, freeing up the top sirloin. It comes down to the pin bone. Cut it around the pin bone. And now underneath your loin bones. Tip of the knife running through the loin bones down to the rib. I've run my knife underneath the loin bones down to the rib. We'll turn it over and run your knife against the backbone down to the ribs. You've already freed up your top sirloin, so you might have to do a little bit of knife point work. Loosen up the final bit, top sirloin. Then you should be able to start peeling your back strap away from the ribs. Laying the knife on the ribs, cutting about 1/2 inch at a time, being very careful not to damage the meat. This is the nicest part of your deer. Pull the back strap off. That. Now again, I could be saving the meat on these ribs to use as spare ribs, but actually, not a lot of meat on there. Here's your back strap out, intact. Trim the tail on it, touch. Down to the top sirloin. And that's your whole back strap. Full back strap with the top sirloin. Back to your carcass. Clear the remaining meat off of the bone on the rib. Running between the ribs. We want to save every bit of good meat that we can. I've finished cleaning the meat off the ribs and any other additional red meat that I might want to pull off of there to throw in the grind. So we've got our backbone void of all meat. Now let's go over what we got out of that whole loin. We've got our two back straps, or actually rib, short loin, and top loin, or top sirloin. And our filet mignons, or our tenderloins. Also, you have your loin tail, which is this lean piece of meat here. You can work that into stew meat or put it in your grind. Take the loin, strip, clean it up just a touch. What we'll do out of this is just make some nice steaks. This is the most tender part of your carcass. You want to take care when we're cutting these steaks. This would be the top sirloin. I'm going to gauge it here. Since these steaks are tender, I'm going to cut those about 1 inch thick. I'll take it and gauge it a bit. Cut some nice steaks off of that. This would be, these are your top loin steaks or your top sirloin steaks if they were considering beef. Now, the rest of your loin, you've got what would be your New York steaks and your Spencer steaks. Since the eye on this strip is relatively small, we're going to cut it about 2 inches thick. Cut them again halfway through, fold them over for your butterfly steaks. So cut them about 2 inches thick. Then come back, cut them about 3/4 the way through so we can butterfly them. These make great steaks on the barbecue. Venison is so lean, it might be a good idea to take and rub some olive oil or peanut oil or salad oil even on these and season them up before you throw them on your grill. That'll help sear all the natural juices in and make them a little bit juicier. So there's your butterfly steaks. Set these off to the side. Okay, again, your loin. You have your rib section, your loin section, your top loin section, or your top sirloin section. I'm going to separate it. Okay. The top sirloin section. Notice there's a bit of tip left on the sirloin here. It's excellent for kebab meat. That is the balance of the sirloin tip, which we left a little bit on there. So we'll cut this into a little bit of kebab meat, about 2-inch squares. Got some nice kebab meat out of that tip. And we'll clean up a little bit of the top and cut this into nice 1-inch thick cut top sirloins. This is what they look like. Nice solid pieces of top sirloin meat. All nice steaks for barbecuing. You can take the other side of your loin. Now if you don't care for butterfly steaks, and you just want to cut these into smaller steaks like a fillet, this is what you're going to have, is a New York style steak. Also a very tender steak. Normally you wouldn't get a full serving out of this steak. That's why you go to the butterfly steak. Take it and gauge that about 2 inches thick, and we'll butterfly the balance of this strap. Cutting about halfway through and folding them over. These are excellent barbecued. Last but not least, the fillet or the tenderloin. Clean it up a little bit. Now the diameter on this tenderloin is quite small, maybe 1.5 inches in diameter. So you have your option of what you'd like to do on this. Some people will take these and butterfly them, and you'll get a little steak maybe the size of your single New York steak here. What I like to do is leave this whole, saute it in a pan, and just slice it thin, and it's delicious. Now that we've got our loin cut up, we'll check out the top round and the sirloin tip we put in the freezer and see how that jerky meat's going to turn out for us. Top round is set up a little bit. Ideally, you'd have it a little more frozen, but we're going to go ahead and show you how. Now, the idea of putting the meat in the freezer to set it up is to give you a nice, firm, crisp piece of meat you can be able to slice thin slices off of to give you that jerky thickness that you're looking for. And this is what we've come up with. Nice thin strips. You'll be able to marinate and put in your dehydrator or your smoker for jerky. I'd like to take this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about safety. First of all, make sure you keep your working area nice and clean and free of grease. Take that extra second to scrape your block off in between cuts. This will make sure your meat doesn't slip around and you get an accidental cut by the meat slipping in your hand. Secondly, there's about 3 basic ways you can get cut aside from a freak accident. One is you've got your free hand out in front of you and you're not paying attention and you're cutting up and you cut your free hand that way, or pulling back with your free hand beneath the blade of your knife. Make sure you keep this free hand away from the blade of the knife. You might be boning and bearing down pulling into your stomach. Just take that extra second to move that piece of meat out in front of you so if you do slip off, you're not slipping into your midsection. Thirdly, if you're using more than one knife, make sure you put your second knife in an area where it's away from your cutting. If you happen to put it underneath a piece of meat and come back later on and pick up that piece of meat, instead you're picking up a handful of knife. This particular block here, I made sure that I fastened it to the countertop to ensure that I don't get any slipping and get hurt that way by my table shifting on me. I want to show you the similarities between the beef loin I have here and your venison loin. Due to the size of the venison loin, I'm going to take and demonstrate on the beef head loin, which will be a bigger cut, and hopefully you can see how the head loin comes apart. I've already separated my beef loin from the head loin, so I've got what is known as the short loin, okay, and this is the top sirloin. Again, the venison loin, I'm going to separate the head loin from the short loin, and we'll have 2 pieces that look like this. Let me set this out of the side for a second. To separate the short loin from the head loin on your venison, you just find the pin bone. You just draw a line right through the pin bone. Take my saw, separate that, and I've got a nice short loin of venison and the head loin or the top sirloin. Notice the similarities between the beef head loin and the venison head loin. I'm going to show you how to bone both of these out, but hopefully with the larger size on the beef will be a better demonstration for you. We'll put the short loins aside for a moment. Starting with the head loin, what you have is filet mignon and your sirloin flap. So take the point of my knife, put it right on the top sirloin bone, and let it ride on the bone right down to the face where we disconnected the short loin. Right down to here, this bone. Then I'm going to take my knife, follow it around, and continue to remove the fillet, using the tip of your knife to run down between the membrane, ensuring that you don't leave any meat on the bone, or as little as possible. Just the tip of your knife, following it all the way down, you're pulling out your filet mignon. You can pull out your bottom sirloin at the same time you're pulling out your filet. Actually, it's a sirloin flap. So I've got my filet and my sirloin flap. And let's go to the venison top and do the same thing. Tip of the knife right along the bone to pull that filet right out. Between the seams, and what I've got is identical pieces of meat, just on a smaller scale with your venison. Okay, to remove the bone from the venison, the boning techniques we're trying to get across is using the tip of the knife with the pressure against the bone. Take your time until you get familiar with it. Tip of the knife against the bone, letting it ride against the bone, like you're drawing a line with the tip of your knife. And feel the bone all the way around. Just cut it away from the bone. So you've got your bone, and you've got your top sirloin of venison. Let's take a look at the top sirloin of beef and do the same procedure. A little bit larger scale again, so we'll be able to get a better idea of what we're doing. Tip of the knife against the top sirloin bone and running it down to separate the meat from the bone. Around the corner, and again, just repeat the step, 1/4 inch at a time, until you get the feel of what you're doing. Get a good idea of what we're doing here. A little bit of pressure, riding the knife alongside of the bone to remove the meat from the bone. Okay, so we've got our bone and we've got top sirloin. Beef, venison. Same muscles, just a different size. Now what you can take, cut these up for your top sirloin steaks. If you're cutting beef, top sirloin steaks, or if you do a thick cut, you're talking Chateaubriand. It's also a nice muscle you can take for a roast if you prefer roast. Beautiful shish kebab meat. Most people prefer to have them cut into steaks. Venison loin here. Notice the short loin and up to the pin bone, and the top loin or the head loin on this side. I'm going to show you how to cut the short loin with the bone in right now. First we'll separate it from the head loin. Again, using our fingers and pressure to find the end of the pin bone, cut a nice square cut. With your hacksaw or meat saw, whatever available to you. And remove the head loin from the short loin. You notice now that I've detached the short loin from the head loin, looks like a miniature porterhouse steak. That's exactly what it is. This would be the small loin chops, which are some of the tastiest chops on the animal. If you had a regular meat saw, you could just zip these through the bandsaw and cut them into chops. Since you don't, like we don't today, we're going to take and knife the short loin down. into approximately 1-inch steaks, cutting them nice and square all the way across. You get down to the end, kind of give yourself a gauge, measure it, so you make sure all your chops are even. You don't end up with a wafer chop on the end or something. Once you've knifed through the chops, separate the meat. Okay. And that's what those look like. Beautiful center cut loin chops. Let's move on to this head loin. We'll cut this top sirloin bone in. Again, it's the same principle. You're going to knife it in even steaks and then use your saw to cut through the bone. Then we'll have bone-in top sirloin steaks. This is one variation to cut your top sirloin if you're having trouble pulling the bone out of it. So we'll knife it and then cut it. Here's a good example of the meat you get from your full loin by cutting it bone in. Your small loin chops and your large loin chops with the fillet left intact. And also out of the loin tail, I've worked into some nice cube meat, which is plenty tender enough to kebab. And I've cut it in a nice larger chunk so you can get some kebabs out of that. I'm going to move on to the rib now. What I've got here is actually 2 halves of the rib section. I've removed the spare ribs off of this rib, and also I've taken the chine off. By removing the chine, which is part of the backbone, it makes it easier to saw through the rib while cutting the rib into chops, or to tie it into a crown roast. Again, you could bone the rib out completely and use the ribs for back ribs. Okay, remember, we removed the spare ribs by cutting at the bottom eye of the rib back through to the blade by marking it first, then taking the saw and cutting one rib bone at a time. A little patience and a little muscle go a long way. So I pulled off my spare ribs, which I happen to like, so I'm going to keep those whole. And that's your rack of spare ribs. Throw those on the barbecue. With the ribs, depending on what you like, this is one of the best parts of the carcass. If they were whole, it'd be part of your back strap on either side. If you wanted to do a fancy roast for company, you'd take and crack the bone between each rib, just sawing through the backbone, standing them on end. You can tie them into a crown roast, which really goes over well with the in-laws. Today, we've elected to cut them into rib chops. So what I'm going to do is take my knife and try to cut between the ribs, each rib, on an even cut, so I end up with even chops all the way across. Proceed to knife them between the ribs. Like that. So they're knifed down to the backbone. Then all we have to do is separate the backbone, bone between. Again, we're using the hacksaw to show you it can be done with household tools. Ideally, a meat saw would be a little more effective. And so on. And there's your rib chops. We'll continue the process of this rib now. We've got our ribs all cut into nice chops here. This is the yield from the 2 ribs. We've got our spare ribs and our rib chops. These are great. This would be just like your Spencer steak with a bone in it if it was beef, or your center cut rib steak, or your prime rib. I want to show you a little trick on the spare ribs. If you're not particularly fond of spare ribs, but you do like some fancy cut riblets, what you do is just take your saw and cut the spare rib into 3 pieces and run your knife down the rib lengthwise. I've got this one cut through here, so I'll show you how to do that. I've cut the ribs in half with the saw, and I'll just take a knife, run down the ribs to make riblets. These are great braised in the broiler or baked. They're a little bit too small to put on the barbecue grill, and that's what your riblets look like. I'm getting hungry. I don't know about you. Moving on to the chuck, or the front shoulder of your carcass. This is one of the trickier pieces to cut. We've already split the backbone, so we've got 2 even halves, and we're going to show you how to bone this out because we don't have a meat saw available to us. Ideally, if you did have a meat saw available to us, you could just zip this into 4 sections and be done with it in a minute. Sections are the shank, the clod, or the shoulder clod, the chuck, which is this square cut area here, and then your neck. We don't have a meat saw here today, and I'm sure you don't either, so I'll show you how to bone this out.
First, I'm going to remove the ribs and the neck bone from the chuck by using the tip of my knife to trace between each rib and then back into the neck. I'll start pulling each rib bone separately off the chuck. The chuck happens to generate a lot more trim than most of the other cuts on your carcass, but if you take your time, you'll be able to get all that red meat off the bone and use it into grind. Or I should say trim. It's best to keep your venison trim as lean as possible because the venison fat has a tendency to give a much gamier taste to your lean trim. A lot of people like to use beef suet or pork fat to flavor their venison. I find it's easier to add the pork fat or beef suet later on after you're thawing your venison. That way it doesn't dissipate and lose flavor in the freezer. Got a bit of cartilage to break from the breast. Turn your knife around and a little force through the cartilage will pop that. Okay, now we've loosened up all the ribs. From the bottom side of the rib, we'll just run our knife down on the inside, leaving as much meat as possible on the chuck, pulling the rib bones out one at a time. Now when you get up into the neck bone, there's a joint here. Using the leverage of the rib, we'll work the tip of the knife into the joint to free it up. This will take a little bit of practice, but after the first couple you'll get the feel of how to pop these joints. And again, take your time, tip of the knife to remove all the ribs from the neck. Pop your knife through the cartilage.
A little bit of pressure if you can't find the exact joint will help you out. Tip of the knife, again into the joint to separate that. Follow it around. All these bones are the same, so once you get past the first few, you'll know how they're shaped and it'll make it easier to pull off the balance of the bones. Now, I could continue to dejoint the neck and take them out one at a time, but I like to scoop the neck out and make soup meat out of these bones here. Very flavorful. So I'm just going to loosely follow around the neck on the bone and scoop the neck out for neck bones, which makes some excellent soup. You can take and crack these with your saw. Crack the bone. Okay, we've removed the ribs and the backbone and the neck. Now we're moving on to the shoulder, shank, the shoulder blade. Put a bit of an edge on the knife. We'll start at the shank. Removing the meat off of the shank, tip of the knife against the bone, and just drawing a line to separate the meat from the bone. Following it all the way down. And then again on the other side, tip of the knife against the bone. Now you're following the bone all the way around. Just lay your knife right on the bone to follow it around that joint. A little patience goes a long way here. Take a little bit extra time to make sure you leave the meat on the shoulder instead of on the bone. There's a little spur here. Trim around that. And you've removed all the meat off the shank bone. Notice I've left it intact to have some leverage when I'm pulling the blade out of the shoulder. Turn it around and notice the lines of the shoulder blade. You can put your thumb here and press hard and feel the shoulder blade or the 7 bone. What I'm going to do is just put my knife right against that bone, pull it, draw a line all the way across the 7 bone out to the blade. Then lift up meat off the blade and use the tip of your knife to skim the meat away from the blade. Okay, now there's a little bit of meat on this other side of the blade. Again, tip of the knife against the bone on the other side. Run it down and then scoop it out. Now the blade comes into the shoulder joint or the thoracic joint. You can loosen up the cartilage around the joint while it's still intact. Then turn your shoulder over and run your knife blade down the other side of the shoulder blade to free it up. Now the blade should be ready to come apart. Put the last tendons holding that shoulder blade on. You've removed your blade. Now the only thing left is the shoulder bone, which goes up to the thoracic joint. So what we're going to do is knife on the bone, drawing a line, and just following the bone across. Both sides. Taking our time to leave the meat on your shoulder. And disconnect it from the shoulder. So we've removed our bone. This is basically what it looks like when it's in the shoulder. Set those bones aside. Now what we've got here is a boneless chuck. Again, I explained the cuts to you when the bone was in. The cuts still apply. We have the shank, which is good for soup meat or your lean grind. We have the shoulder clod, which would end at the joint. So we're going to separate that now. This is excellent for steaks or roasts. Then we have our boneless chuck, which you would cut across the grain this way for steaks. The neck is a good source for stew or lean trim again. Let's cut some boneless chuck steaks here. About 1 inch thick. These are good on the grill. I'm going to cut a few boneless chuck steaks here, and we'll show you what they look like after they come off. I've boned out the other shoulder. Now I'm going to show you how to slice the shoulder clod into steaks and then tie the neck of the chuck into a roast. The shoulder clod, if you'll notice, the grain runs this direction, like the grain of wood. So when you're slicing your shoulder steaks, you want to maintain cutting against the grain throughout the shoulder clod. These are nice pan frying steaks, so you don't necessarily want them too thick. I like to slice them about 1/2 inch and just fry up a quick steak. The tail you could slice thin for jerky meat or slice into cubes for kebabs or stew meat or grind. Here's what the shoulder clod steaks look like. Nice lean steak. We'll set those aside for a moment. Come back. Now after I've sliced the chuck into boneless chuck steaks, I've got the neck and part of the chuck remaining. Since it's not large enough to make one roast out of, I'm going to take the other side of the chuck and put them together and tie them into a nice big size, good size roast. Standard butchered twine. Put the twine underneath the roast. Bring your index finger up. Lay the twine on top of your finger. Twirl it around. Put your thumb through the loop. Grab the pigtail. Cinch it down and then snap it tight. And to lock that knot in, take a loop, cinch it down onto your knot. There you go. Nice chuck roast. Boneless chuck roast, rolled boneless clod roast, stew meat, or you can actually go through that and get some kebab meat or additional jerky. You have your shoulder clod steaks, your boneless chuck steaks, which are great for barbecuing. You have your shank meat, which is good for soups, your necks, which great for flavor for soups, and some additional trim here, which you can make jerky, cube meat, or lean grind. That leaves the breast. The breast, most hunters have been known to leave this breast in the field. It's a good source of some lean trim, and also you have the option, you can dress the breast up by scoring the top with the tip of your knife. Then you take the flap from the other side. You can take some nice ground venison mixed with some pork or beef suet and stuff that and bake that. It's a very tasty piece of meat. Now that we have our game processed and cut to our own specifications instead of relying on the local butcher, we're going to ensure that we protect that in the freezer by freezer wrapping it. I've selected a good heavy quality freezer wrap which has a poly coated side, like a wax side, to maintain a good seal in the freezer. I'm going to start with my loin chops. The idea behind freezer wrapping is ensuring that you do not get any air touching the meat after it's wrapped, avoiding any type of freezer burn. I like to use the butcher wrap. It's easy to learn. You place your stakes in the lower right-hand corner of your paper on a diagonal angle. If you're wrapping something with a bone in, one nice tip is to cover your bone with just a little extra piece of paper. This eliminates the bone poking through the paper and exposing any type of freezer burn. You hold the paper firmly and pull it tightly. Fold your corners in to get a nice tight seal on the end. Fold that over. Again, push your paper in to form a nice seal on this corner. Roll it over and then roll it up tightly. Tape, I happen to have gum tape here, which works nicely. And you have a nice even package of center cut loin chops. So that's your little small loin chops. Moving on to a roast. On a larger piece of meat, such as a roast, you might want to double wrap it. So you same type of butcher wrap, ensuring that you've got your corners tight, sealing the roast, then rolling tight with a little bit of pressure. Again, make sure you're using the waxy side of the paper. And repeat the process. This way it'll protect your roast from freezer burn. After wrapping a roast nice and tight, you'll be able to store it in your freezer for a year without any worry of freezer burn. If you happen to have a particular roast or a function that you might want to use this special roast for, go ahead and note that with a star or Randy's birthday or whatever the special occasion may be, so you know exactly where you're going to go into your freezer to pull that roast out. And of course the date, so you know how long it's been in your freezer. I'm Chuck Pencer, your video meat cutter, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching. We trust that you found this video both informative and interesting. Other titles include everything you'll need to learn to process your meat, poultry, and fish. Process like a pro.
Welcome to the Home Meat Cutting Series. My name's Chuck, and today I'm going to show you how to process your carcass like a pro. And with these tips, we will embellish upon you today.
Chuck, we're getting this thing. Okay, now I'll bring in the loins and we'll do the comparison.
Good.
If it happens to be on top of the margarita mix, so be it. Okay, now I'm going to show you the primary techniques in breaking.